Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we're going to be talking about the newest album from As It Is, called The Great Depression. So, I remember hearing some promising things about this pop-punk, pop-rock band a couple of years back, and maybe while the production was a little more polished and the lyrics a little less interesting than I would personally prefer, the hooks were pretty damn strong, and that gave me some actual hope of what could be coming next. And then I started digging through their next couple of projects and coming to the realization that the hooks might be all they really have, and wait a minute, didn't I already make this review for State Champs a couple months ago? Do you guys understand why I typically leave these bands on the Warped Tour circuit for John over at ARTV if I can't really tell most of their material apart and don't really find them all that interesting to begin with? Now, in fairness, As It Is did seem to have a slightly different formula, with the second singer and the slightly more pop-centric production focus and slightly more emo lyrics, which seemingly came at the cost of good production and any sense of deeper weight and stakes. Yeah, I hate to echo a lot of the other critics here, but despite being a slightly more dynamic group, both As It Is records are a lot more uneven than I can really excuse, and the hooks never quite had the same punch as other bands in the genre like Neck Deep or State Champs, saying nothing of the upper tier bands in this format. They were generally passable albums, but rarely better than that. And yet, I was kinda curious to give The Great Depression a full review. Apparently, the band had gotten darker and more ambitious and had dived towards more abrasive, emo-leaning material, which really is the sort of edge that this group could desperately need, even if it is kind of trendy right now, so I was intrigued where this could go. So fine, what do we get with The Great Depression? Well, here's the thing. This is probably As It Is' most distinctive and ambitious album to date. I will give them that. Clearly aiming for a darker but still somewhat trendy, emo-adjacent pop rock sound with a little bit more heft and gravitas. But note that I said aiming for and not achieved, because while this is probably the As It Is record that I like the most, it's not exactly a project that's resolved my long-standing issues with this band, and the shift in sound only further highlights some of their weaknesses that in a different era of modern pop rock would brand them as a wannabe or an also-ran. And when you factor in a larger element of lyrical meta-commentary that I'm not remotely sure this band can back up, well, it runs into frustrating territory. A good album, but not at all a great one. Actually, let's start off with the lyrics, because As It Is framed The Great Depression as more of a concept album release, with our central poet character being caught up between his depression and self-destructive tendencies, and a wholesome girl character who winds up becoming the solitary tether to our protagonist to emotional actualization and really survival. Hell, in the two-tongued screaming salvation, she's quite literally framed as the angel on one shoulder. Now, we'll come back to this in particular, but what's more interesting for me to note is how, right out of the start on The Great Depression, the title track, there is some self-aware commentary about the system commodifying depression and grief and angst, and that can ring as exploitative in the face of real emotions that poet and protagonist might feel in the creation of his art. Hell, if this album has a palpable enemy, and when it picks up the most actual teeth, is when it's targeting that system when it feeds and exacerbates mental health issues, egging them on when there is a profit to be had, and on the Stigma, Boys Don't Cry, forcing that poet to bottle them in at all their times when it's not convenient or easy. And like Deaf Havana before them, As It Is being self-aware about their artistic connection with the audience informs some of that feedback loop they can have with bringing the angst to the forefront in the art, but it's also where my compliments on the writing start coming to a swift close for two distinctive reasons. And the first ties back to that feminine presence that, despite being on the cusp of being dumped on songs like The Fire of the Dark, winds up being caught up in the push and pull of our protagonist's internal struggle, and yet that self-aware commentary on that side of things is a little bit more muted and shallow than it probably should be, especially in the scene right now. Yes, you get moments like on the second verse of The Haunting calling out artists who are manipulative and predatory and deserve to be called out, and The Truth I'll Never Tell tries to enforce some distance that our protagonist will never be perceived like that, but it doesn't quite get around songs the handwritten letter that could very well fall in the same purpose and framing to that audience, which can lead to some muddy messaging that self-flagellating framing can only excuse so far, because the band kind of wants to pull on the same emotional heartstrings. And that leads to the other thing. For as much as the album wants to try to spit against the system as the easy, popular antagonist right now, it never really challenges the system that hard, be it the content or execution. Yes, more the struggle is internal here. But it's a little jarring when the album wants to get meta in its framing about the larger industry, but won't commit to a more detailed subversion and winds up cribbing lyrical and production cliches from My Chemical Romance circa 2005. And that's relevant, because if As It Is wanted to make comment on systemic issues within emo and alternative pop rock going back decades, maybe it's not the greatest idea to borrow so heavily across the board from acts that perpetuated some of those issues and cliches. But what gets all the more frustrating is that when it comes to those sonic recreations, they're arguably more tolerable than the original choices that As It Is makes, because at least they're aping a formula that's worked. Or, to put it another way, it's not exactly a good thing that when you start your dark emo revival record, hopping on a deliberately synthetic pop beat complete with snaps and fizzy effects that do nothing to highlight the band's persistent lack of good bass lines. Yeah, the guitars might have some decent crunch to them, but with a really undercooked low end, we're stuck with songs that clearly want to hit a lot harder given the greater emphasis and reverb placed on the drums, but aren't willing to truly crank up some nastier, more distorted tones. For a quick comparison's sake, and it's kind of a fair one given the quasi-gothic lyrical style that doesn't go all the way, and samples that they sneak onto songs like the two-tongue Screaming Salvation, let's take a look at My Chemical Romance. Yeah, they could crank the melodrama up to 11, and the lyrics could definitely trend towards some dicey territory in a modern context, let's get real here, but the band was truly willing to embrace some uglier sounds, the really underappreciated grinding bass lines, and the guttural delivery in order to intensify their point. Whereas, As It Is, well, I'm sorry, it's the same complaint I would make about their lyrics on this album. They got some good ideas that are on the cusp of going somewhere, but completely underserved, never taken all the way. For one, when you have a band with two distinctive vocalists, I have no idea why As It Is continues to flounder by not giving them unique roles within the album's narrative. This was an issue on OK as well, and it smacks of utterly wasted potential in terms of songwriting. Then we get the badly mixed in pop concessions that really don't need to be there. I get wanting a ballad with a song like The Question and the Answer, but doubling down on the dreamy layers of reverb around the acoustic guitar and strings before we get the backbeat and the really ugly mixing of the snap, it turns a quiet moment of contrast into an obvious play for crossover that they really don't need and they probably won't get. Same with The Hurt, The Hope, which might have worked if the percussion programming was remotely well mixed and the compression wasn't so blatant. And even then, you're getting tones from both instruments and vocals across this album that actively clip the edges of the mix, even some of the better rock songs. I took a look at the credits of producer Gene Freeman and I wasn't really all that impressed by what I saw on his list, but the band looked to be just as active in co-producers, so it looks like everybody's gonna share some of the blame here. And that's before you consider the blocky and warped pickups trying to split the difference between the big poppy hooks that remain As It Is' greatest strength and a pretty questionable under-oath influence on the other side. Hell, they even got Aaron Gillespie on this record. But songs that can split the difference effectively between the brighter hooks and the heavier tones and textures, they're rare. And more of this album hits this wonky, watered-down middle ground that proves increasingly unsatisfying. Even if cuts like the Stigma, Boys Don't Cry, the two-tongue Screaming Salvation, and The Truth I'll Never Tell mostly connect, they're pretty good songs. But at the end of the day, the biggest issue I have with the Great Depression, it's really one that I've always had with As It Is as a band, because they're a promising group that scratches the surface of some interesting ideas and bringing a lot of energy to their hooks, but cannot execute beyond the surface level, with sloppy production and underwhelming lyrics keeping them from rising to the upper tier or even really a lot of the mid-tier in this genre. And it's very hard for me to recommend the band when we're in the middle of a pop-punk and emo revival that's introducing some real heavyweights to this conversation that can go deeper. So for me, extremely light 6 out of 10, and even then it feels like I'm being generous. Because this is not a bad record, there's enough good ideas, intentions, and hooks in order to keep this passable, but let's get real. If As It Is does not get some serious polish going forward, I'm not going to stay interested. And even then, I'm not sure I'm going to be interested in this album for much long either. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know, As It Is fans, I tried guys, I went through the entire discography, but there's a lot better bands who are doing this sound and doing it better in the genre right now. I can rattle them off pretty easily, but hey, if you guys want to actually buy the record, links down there below, and the polls there for y'all tell me how wrong I am. And that's not me being bitter, but hey, I know the fans are there, I know what the results are going to be. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or help support the channel, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. My schedule is linked down there below. It's on my Instagram. I post it fairly regularly. Also, keep in mind, if you're asking why I haven't covered Nicki Minaj yet, well, nobody's voted for it yet, so that's why. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.
Bring you down.